I'm Sue Hosking from the University of Adelaide, and I'm here to introduce Deborah Robertson, which is a considerable pleasure. Deborah is a Western Australian writer with a magic touch. So far, whatever she's written has become prize-winning material. Her first book, Proud Flesh, was a book of short stories, and that, I'd say, is an achievement in itself, to publish a whole book of short stories at a time when the short story has been declared by some, at least, an endangered species. Proud Flesh won the Steele Rudd Award for the Best Australian Short Story Collection in 1998, and Deborah's then gone on to try her hand at a novel. That novel, Careless, which looks at the contemporary world through the eyes of a child, won the 2006 Colin Roderick Award and the 2007 Nita B. Kibble Award. It was also longlisted for the Orange Broadband Prize, shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the Age Book of the Year, and the Miles Franklin Award, along with such distinguished company as Peter Carey, Gail Jones and Alexis Wright. Now that's not bad for a first novel. And Deborah's just told me that Careless has been released just last week in the United States, and that it's also been translated into Hebrew and Dutch. So, what next? So I'll hand over to Deborah now. Thank you.
Hello. It's wonderful to be here. There's something about the white marquee that has a sort of flavour of a wedding, which is nice. I always find it difficult to talk about what my book is about. It's a bit like saying what was a car accident about, or what was a love affair about. A book is an experience like a love affair or a car accident. It has repercussions that sort of travel far beyond your that travel far beyond your initial ideas. I did find out after the book had come out from reviewers and from readers that the book was about grief. And perhaps as readers you don't understand that your reading of our work is part of what the work is. It's a bit like those dried sea monkeys that need water to be added. They only kind of blossom in the water, and in a sense the writer's work only blossoms with your response, your interpretation. So it was really perhaps your own patterns of grieving, your own knowledge of grieving, the way you see grieving in our lives, that sort of drew this theme from my work, because I hadn't deliberately placed it there. Certainly I was writing from a time that contained loss in my own life. I had lost a very close friend, and middle age always brings with it certain kinds of losses. So there was that impulse behind the book, but I did not set out to write a book about grieving. I did set out to write a book that had a subject that would keep me at the desk day after day for perhaps a couple of years. So it had to be a subject that I found compelling, that I did a subject that had lots of questions in it which had remained unanswered to me. One of those subjects was forms of memorialisation, how we grieve both publicly and privately, and how memorials seek to give shape to both of those forms of mourning. But I'm going to talk about memorials on a panel about death in a couple of days' time, so I don't kind of want to prematurely ejaculate. And so I'll move on to another subject that I was intensely interested in when I wrote Careless. And that was a sort of a dual subject, the subject of empathy and the limits of personal empathy, but also the role of imagination in empathy, how difficult it is sometimes to enter someone else's life if we don't have an imagination of that life. But the largest area of my research and my concern, I guess my passion, this was the passion that drove the book, was the subject of the history of children's lives in Australia. And it had seemed to me for a long time that if we looked at Australian life and history through children's lives, we had a pretty unsettling picture in front of us. Just think, for example, of this kind of timeline since European settlement. There are all the children of colonial times, the sort of pioneer children, strangers in a strange land. As Sue mentioned to me before we began here today, children who fell down wells, children who got lost in the bush, wandered away from home, who fell, in a sense, prey to this new landscape that they didn't know, and their parents didn't know, and perhaps their parents didn't know, therefore, the limits, the dangers inherent in that landscape. Following on from the sort of colonial times, there was the sort of successive waves of European immigration where children were taken from family and brought to Australia in the care of church and state. Now, these children were not orphans. These children were, they belonged to impoverished families, families that just couldn't care for a large number of children. So they were taken, in many cases, from siblings and from parents, and brought into care in Australia. And I'm sure we all know some of the histories. Fairbridge Farm in Western Australia is a very acute example of a place of negligence to be kind and brutalisation to be factual. Following on from that, of course, we have the decades of Aboriginal children being taken from family and from land. It's interesting. I found a phrase that was used. I found a phrase in my research that came up again and again with regard to the European immigrant children, but also to the Aboriginal children of the stolen generation. And the phrase was used to describe the policy of breaking siblings apart. And I guess the only reason that you would break siblings apart would be to, I guess, undermine them in every way possible. And this policy was sort of colloquially termed split the litter. And this was a policy which, strangely, hadn't heard that term before my research, but it was definitely a term that was, it was a policy applied to the breaking up of siblings. The 2004 Senate report into children in care, which came out in 2004, strangely enough, was a very, very sobering report. Some of you probably remember the media coverage of this very, very thorough report of the lives and the fates of children in church and state care, really from the 1930s right through to the 1970s. And the sort of systemic brutalisation and dehumanisation of children. And then, since I wrote this novel, Careless, and since its publication, we have yet another report, which of course is the most recent report entitled Little Children Are Sacred, which is about the lives that children are leading in Indigenous communities, mostly across the north of this country, but not exclusively. So there was this timeline, this recorded, in a sense, a sort of tragic history of Australia's children that interested me. But I was also interested in the individual lives of children that have come to be known to us through sort of popular media. You know, the Sydney Opera House lottery kidnapping, for example, in the 60s, the death of Graham Thorne, and the fate of the Beaumont children. In more recent times, Jaden Lesby's murder. And in each of these sort of stories of a child's fate, we see something about Australia at a particular time in its history. And it was really that history that I was wanting to somehow explore in Careless. But I'm not a historian and I'm not a polemicist. I was trying to write fiction, and the only way that I could explore this topic in fiction was to work it through a child's sensibility, to kind of dig as deeply as I could into a child's being, if that doesn't sound too pompous, and to ask the sorts of questions about what happens to children in peril in Australia in a contemporary world. I like fiction in which there is something at stake, and I think there's always something at stake in the contemporary, because in a sense it's the future that's at stake in the here and now. So I wanted to write a book about contemporary Australia that didn't record dryly the historical story of children's lives, but somehow sort of resonated them through the book. And so I chose to write about a 9-year-old girl, Pearl, and the death of some children, and the way that she and other people are affected by these deaths and the private and public forms of mourning. Now, perhaps I want to tell you a couple of small stories which might give you an insight into how fiction comes to grow, because that's what it does do. You start off with very little, and if you're kind of bloody-minded enough to just sit there for long enough, it grows. I was always troubled about how I would structure this book. I wanted the child to be at the centre, but I wanted, in a sense, the effect of throwing a pebble into water, the kind of ripples that move out from a tragedy involving children. And I puzzled this structure for a very long time until something happened one Christmas Eve, and I got a sense of where I might be. I was at my local shops around midday on Christmas Eve, and as you know, Christmas Eve is a crazy time. Everyone's shopping, everyone's kind of working against the clock, because of course the shop's going to be closed for 2 days. How terrifying. And so I was at my local shopping centre, and it's a small shopping centre in a quiet suburb. And I went out into the car park, and I was sort of aware of a hubbub, that something was going on, but I couldn't tell what. So I sort of fought my way through various rings of people. And there, at the centre of this hubbub, was the problem. Now, the problem was a little boy had got his head stuck in a bus stop. I don't know if you've got this particular kind of bus stop, this torture implement in South Australia, but in Western Australia we have these fabulous kind of concrete-sided. They're about 6 inches thick, and they're just concrete sides, and they've got little viewing holes, so they're about that big, so you know when the bus is coming and you can leap up. But also, if you're a 6-year-old, they're there to put your head through. They're perfect size. So this little boy had put his head through the hole, and then I guess his ears had sort of opened, and he couldn't get it out. And I started to ask some questions of people in the crowd, and he'd been there for an hour at this stage. So the fire brigade arrived, and the ambulances arrived, and the police arrived. And we all stood and watched, and it's sort of an Italian suburb that I live in, so there were lots of elderly Italian people crying out, "Bambino, Bambino," and it was a very dramatic and quite worrying scene. One of the things that I was really drawn to was the face of the mother in this scene. Now, the car park was full of four-wheel drives and people loading up their cars with Christmas abundance, but this woman had very, very little, kind of one shopping bag. And it was quite obvious from the way that she was responding to the attentions of the police and the ambulance that it had been a very, very long time since anyone had paid her any attention. She, in a sense, had become an invisible mother. She was a single mother, I learnt later. And as we sort of all stood there and sort of offered moral support, some people carried food and drinks out to the mother and the little boy. I suddenly sort of thought that I understood the structure that I wanted to use for Careless, which was the structure that we were all standing in, you know, the child in a dilemma, and then the kind of concentric circles of care, the ambulance, the police, and their professional, focused concern, but then right through to to neighbours and to people who were compelled by this little boy's fate. And that really is the structure of Careless. Alongside the structure of any novel, we always have the problem of tone. And tone is not an easy thing to manage. It's not something that comes naturally. It is something that's directly married to subject matter. So because my subject matter was so grave, I didn't want to risk a sort of a pompous or a serious or dare I say self-righteous tone, because it's easy to be self-righteous about other people's lives, especially children. So I sort of sat with this discomfort of not quite knowing what tone to use until something happened at a time when I was writing the book. And what happened was the findings of a coronial inquiry were released, and this inquiry was into the deaths. This is a case that some of you will remember perhaps. It was a coronial inquiry into the deaths of two young jackaroos they were both 16, one was 15, one was 16, who both left their homes in New South Wales and gone to work on a big station, a cattle property in the Kimberley of Western Australia. They'd been there 4 months, but they were put on an outpost where they were completely cut off from everyone else. And as the coronial inquiry found, they were mistreated by by management of the station, really, who had been tasked with looking after them. So they ran away, as kids do. But they ran away into the Gibson Desert in a week of 55-degree temperatures, which is probably about 23 degrees hotter than it is now. And their car broke down and they died of exposure and dehydration after a couple of days. Now, that's kind of hard enough to take, that story. But as part of the coronial inquiry, there was material evidence was released for the first time, and the last boy to die was a boy was called James Annetts. The other boy's name was Stephen Amos. And James did this thing which I think was incredible. On an empty Coke can, he'd somehow found an implement to scratch a message on the tin cover of the Coke can, and he'd scratched that he was sending his love to his mum and his sister, but then he scratched "It's my fault," and he spelt fault F-O-L-T.